Welcome, guys. I do think there is a prevalent and important subject that requires attention. There is parallels in the social discourse that of the meanderings of talk, but the particulars of this is more universal and substantial and deserves its breakdown, whether or not it is concurrent with discourse. There are certain universal themes that will reoccur in every generation and every moment because, well, they're universal and they require understanding. Those two characteristics that come together will then decide those themes. For example, the notion of birth, the notion of death, the notion of childhood versus adulthood, right? Those things are both universal and are not going to change with time. They take attendance of the creation of one's development, but they also require knowledge and education of understanding. It is not default to understand such things. Anyhow, the theme of discussion at the moment, I think is prevalent, I think it's important, is the power of a victim. In that, by being in the oppressive state, by being bound to the overarching oppression, and we are being universal here, so it's not individualistic oppression, it could be physics, it could be biological, it could be hierarchical, it could be of any of these things. But the general theme is that in the state of oppression, in the state of loss of vitality based on the controlling mechanism that is outside of one's influence, there is a strong advantage in that state by being able to see from a scope, from a lens, a wide range lens, right? It's because of the loss of aptitude and composure, one is completely honed in on the specific focus and ability. Now, generally speaking, it is assumed that one in such a state, or an aspect in such a state, will be unable to hone that focus in the aspects that do matter. But it is very well able for them to utilize that tool in the direction that, if serving well, will be overwhelming to any other system or aspect because of their deep focus and attention sphere into that aspect. It is like trying to find a needle in a haystack, but in the honing in ability of focusing on that attentive aspect, one is now with the tool that can create the scalable version that is untenable for all other parties. More so than this, and more prevalent than this, is the fact that in the right extension of such a state of loss, one is then completely available to the tenability of social succession. Right? If two adults are in conflict and they are bombarding each other with either verbal or physical exchange, the loss of sociability between them, or its availability of extension, is thus departed from their purview, but is then available, for example, a child to take perspective. It is though the onlooker, the child, is then able to proceed upon such adulthood fragility and gain the details that are being lost in the process of their degradation. So that in the case of being so subservient to what is beyond it, one is then at the forefront. It's the front lines of the succession of change. Now, in the general case, it is assumed that there is a normal succession taking place, so that there is no stage show for such frontline ability. But this is generally not the case. This is assumed to be, but it is not the case, because there is fragility and vulnerability in the system, in the succession of sociability, that then has such frontline access take precedence to a point where it will be the discharge of detail going forward. It is then the case that all are subserving to it. By being at the front line and gaining the ability, take the example we've mentioned of the conflict of adults. The child that gains the aptitude that is missing in the adults is now at the behest of those details for which now the adults are in subservient nature towards. They require the extraction from the child. They are dependent of the details of understanding that continues onward through the child to gain that level of detail that has been lost. Yet, the very state of nature of being in a social status of oppression has the dependence, these new converted dependents, for being unavailable, at least in their status, to such acceptance. This leaves them at a standstill, which only further exemplifies the premise of the victim's extension, being that in their state of standstill, of not continuing, because that would be the loss of the social status, that of being the oppressor or the one in the state of systemic enlargement, the one of broadness. They are now not only dependent but unavailable to any furtherment, because they are unavailable to take heed with that dependency. This exacerbates the process, so that not only has the front row seat of tenability taking precedence, and not only is there a dependency, there's also the very social status to work against the dependence, so that they do not move along in the process, become humble, and take charge of what is needed to gain extension. In the real case, it is only a simple perspective gained by the victim's knowledge. They do not have the ability of the full broader system. They are but the oppressed and compressed state of being. But in the continuing nature of this process, they gain more and more knowledge through the cycle of standstill that the social status is enlarging in disparity. This then proves to be the track of education, being that there is no other process other than these states of vantage, for then what is left is a full conversion of the victim to its broader system. It is the case that the victim doesn't follow the educational path because at the end of the day they are not apted for such a process. They are not engineered and they don't contain the tools for such aptitude. So that not only is there a standstill on the side of oppressor, there is also the state of dependency that standstills the victim in being unavailable to follow a track of progression. Thus, this leads the entire system to await some sort of change, either of the oppressor in losing its attachment to the social status in lieu of their existential dependency, the reality of the situation, or it is upon the victim to develop a track of thought that creates an educational pattern to overtake the entire process for which all oppression is then possible. But in the final situation, the final conclusion of the process, they can then begin their own oppressive stance to create a new form of victim, which begins the process anew. Now, this cycle can occur in a moment's instant, or it could be multiple generations or millenniums for that matter. It is upon the willingness of change of each party. Thank you for listening.